Okay, welcome to another WaveLab Live-Stream. I'm Justin Perkins, and thanks for tuning in. If everyone, or if anybody that's watching can let me know everything sounds okay. Should be the same settings as last time, but I'm watching the comments, so aside from any questions, definitely let me know if anything needs to look or sound better, and I'm happy to adjust. Today's episode or edition, I'm going to be talking about how to export vinyl masters and cassette masters, and more specifically masters that are used for vinyl production, whether it's cutting lacquers or cassette production, which I'll talk about. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds of how to make it sound good on vinyl, because that is a whole different can of worms, and I'm honestly not a lacquer cutting engineer, so I'm not really a specialist, but I have many years of experience of handing off masters to cutting engineers, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is not going to be how to make it sound great on vinyl. It's more about how to export the files in the correct kind of ideal format that a cutting engineer is going to want, some things that you shouldn't do, and also some documentation. It's not required, but I think cutting engineers really like it when you provide a PDF file for each side of the record, so they know when each song starts and stops, because while you might be very familiar with your project, a cutting engineer doing many sides a day, all different genres, sometimes it's just nice if they know exactly where each song is meant to start and stop, because I guess maybe some people don't know this, but the visual bands that you see on a vinyl record, when I was younger, I just kind of assumed that was because of silence, but it's actually something that the cutting engineer purposely puts on the record when they're cutting it. They can press a button, the grooves look different. Again, I'm not an expert, so I'm not even going to pretend, but they can put a visual band that kind of indicates where should the listener drop the needle to hear, song 2 or song 3 or song 4 on that side. So it's nice if they have a PDF file that kind of confirms that, yes, this is a new song. This isn't like a bridge, or if there's two songs that kind of flow together, where should that be? So things like that. I'm going to talk about exporting the correct files. So a couple other quick things before I get into it. I did do kind of a soft launch of this WaveLab Help website. It's just wavelabhelp.com. And as you can see, there's links to all the videos. And one that I did recently, kind of unofficially outside of this monthly thing, is I did a video about preferences and settings. So if you're trying to download some of my WaveLab preferences, it kind of goes through how to access that folder, where the files are, and things like that, and how to import them into your WaveLab, or also just back up your WaveLab preferences if you want to back them up. I highly recommend backing up your WaveLab preferences folder, which I have favorited over here. Highly recommend backing that up to a cloud or something, so that if you have a computer crash, or if you unexpectedly get a new computer, or even if you purposely get a new computer, you can have all your WaveLab settings kind of stored on the cloud, and within a minute you're back up and running just as you were on your last computer with WaveLab, or your last software install. So anyways, you can check out that preferences and settings video on the website. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. You can download presets that I've made for, rendering formats, things like that. It's loading a little slow. Downloads, links to the WaveLab forum, WaveLab users group, and you can also book some time. I haven't really had time lately to do any one-on-ones, but you can also book some one-on-one time to help with your WaveLab thing. Hoping that within the next couple weeks here, my schedule is less slammed and I can do more of them. But for now, it is what it is. So there it is. So that is that WaveLab Help. I'm going to get into actually, I'm going to start with vinyl, because that's a little more interesting. Cassette can be probably less interesting and also less frequent, but believe it or not, people are making cassettes again. I send out a handful of cassette masters every month. It kind of varies, but there are things that you may want to consider when providing that, and I'll go over that as well. But I'm going to start with the vinyl. So I guess I don't understand the question about stereo field and blank space. But if you want to elaborate on that, I can get back to that question. But for now, let's open up WaveLab. Now, this is assuming you've already mastered it for digital and they've approved that. I have had some cases where people ask me to master it for vinyl first because vinyl takes longer to make, and I kind of get that. You want to get that out the door, but people are not used to hearing digital music, mastered for vinyl, so it's probably going to be a little quieter than you would expect. So typically, almost 100% of the time, I like to get the digital master approved first, because that's how people are kind of used to hearing music these days. Then once the digital master is approved, then I kind of branch off and create the vinyl. You can call it a vinyl pre-master, a cutting master. But there's a few reasons why you want to do that. Of course, you want the song spacing to be the same as the digital version. You want the whether there's long spaces between the songs or songs overlapping. So you don't want to have to do it twice. So this is kind of a project that I mocked up here from an existing project. I don't want to get that out of the name. So let's say that I sent out, now this is my original montage. These are my captures from analog with a little bit of digital limiting applied afterwards. And this is essentially what I sent out to the client as the digital master. Now it's louder than that because there's a limiter running and some plugins in the montage. But my point here is, once they've approved the digital master, I of course deliver all the master formats. So here's, the band is called the WaveLabs because I just made that up. Here's all their digital WAV files, 24-bit, 96K. So I've delivered all those, and now it's time to make the vinyl master. So what I would do is go back to my original montage with all the plugins, kind of my final sequence, and I highly suggest doing a save as, which is shift and the letter S, and giving it a new name. For me, I like to use this name. I just call it 2496 Vinyl Pre-Master version 1 because that was the version that was approved. And the reason I call it 2496 is because I'm going to be dithering these files to 24-bit, and it's going to be 96K. For vinyl, you can, there's really no hard rules, but there's no reason to deliver the vinyl master at, CD quality of 16-bit 44.1 because, vinyl has no sample rate and bit depth limitations. It's usually best to provide the vinyl master in the highest available resolution. There's no need to upsample it, but you also don't need to reduce it. So I go back to my source montage where I made the original digital master and then just save as. So I'm going to branch off here. And I kind of purposely picked this project because of the nature of it. As you can see, I didn't capture them in too hot from analog. There's still a lot of peak headroom there. Other projects you may not be so lucky. Maybe you're hitting your converters a little bit hard and you kind of have to decide if you've hit them too hard to be vinyl friendly, but really there's no reason to capture from analog with any kind of limiting or clipping anymore, in my opinion, because you can do all that very nicely digitally and then you don't paint yourself into a corner. Because right now I can open up the original session and do some vinyl friendly modifications. Now again, this is a little bit on the conservative side for how loud I capture, but it's more of a traditional kind of jazz bossa nova thing with no vocals. So it's a little more on the extreme side, but I picked it for kind of dramatic effect, if you will. So as you saw, I just saved as, because you don't want to start modifying your digital master for vinyl because then you can't ever get back to how it was. So this is a save as. As mentioned, saving as a montage does not create a whole bunch of new files. All it did was create this little montage file, which is only 39 kilobytes. So very hard drive friendly. Not a big deal to just branch off. And now I can do whatever I want and not ruin my original digital master settings. So another thing with vinyl is, there's obviously a limited amount of time you can fit on a vinyl record on each side. And you're going to see various numbers as you Google and search the internet. Some people say stay under 17 minutes per side for good sounding vinyl. Some say 18, 19. Some say you can stay under 22. It really just depends on the material, how it's prepared, who's cutting the material, what lathe they're using to cut the material. I mean, there's so many variables. The bottom line is the shorter the side, the better and louder it can usually sound. And pushing the limits of the side, like going into 21, 22, 23 minutes, that's when some compromises have to be made when it's being cut, whether it's dumping some low end, whether it's cutting it quieter, whether it's dealing with some distortion and intergroove distortion at the end of each side. Maybe you've noticed if you have some records that don't sound so great at the end of each side, that's probably why. So again, there's no hard cutoff time like with CDs or a reel of tape, but shorter the better. Sometimes I have mastered records that are, 48 minutes long, and I have to have that conversation with the client of, I know this is your project and not mine, but I would suggest removing a song or two to make it more vinyl friendly. And sometimes people do that. Sometimes people will remove a song just for the vinyl version. Sometimes people will remove a song or two altogether for the digital too and save those for an EP or a single, bonus tracks kind of thing. But the point is, you do need to be aware of how long it is. And this one, again, is kind of on the shorter side. So this one would sound great on vinyl. So what we need to do is determine where side B is going to start. And, you can look at the timeline. This is a simple one. There's 10 songs. So typically 5 songs on each side would work. And you can see that side A would end at 16:55, essentially. Great for vinyl. This is kind of a dream situation. And then there's a couple ways to determine the length of side B. If you're just eyeballing it, you can select a clip and then shift select over here. And I can see on the bottom that side B is going to be about 17:48. But there's a better way. So once we get into actually preparing for vinyl, what we're going to do is go to the CD tab, which I know is a little bit weird because we're doing vinyl, but it's called the CD tab. And we're going to use CD track groups to determine which songs are on which side. And this really comes into play for 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is we're going to render a continuous file for each side of the record. So instead of sending one file per song, we're actually going to send it off as one file per side. And I've had maybe 1 or 2 cutting engineers or pressing plants ask me for the songs as one file per song, but I find that to be pretty rare. I think most, but of course not all, cutting engineers prefer it to be 1 file per side. Reason being is then they don't have to worry if they're putting the songs in the correct order, which I know sounds simple, but can be a serious problem when you're talking about manufacturing stuff. They don't have to worry about if they were supposed to put 2 seconds of space between the songs or just line the files up back to back. So there's a lot of things that just get automatically handled if we're rendering 1 file per album side. It's just easier to deal with. A whole lot of pluses. And I feel like if anyone that's cutting the record needs to address something on a per song basis, it's very easy in mastering software to split it up into, section it off and apply the effects. And so that's one reason why we use CD track groups. The other reason is to produce a PDF file that tells the cutting engineer where each song starts. And while that may sound simple, the problem is with most audio software and even some mastering software is they can only produce a report that starts from 0. So that means the songs on side A make sense, but it doesn't make sense to the cutting engineer if it says that the first song of side B starts at 18 minutes and 12 seconds, that then they have to do a whole lot of math, and it just doesn't make sense. So one thing that WaveLab added a couple versions ago is the ability to create a PDF report that is going to start at 0, just like side B starts at 0. So we don't have to, I used to have to make a separate montage for side A and side B and then slide side B down to 0 seconds so that the report matched the audio file. And I think that's how you have to do it in a number of mastering software. But WaveLab has solved that issue. So there's two reasons to determine the CD track group. So up here in the CD tab, we see group. I'm going to choose group A. And by default, that puts all the songs in group A, which is, of course, not what we want. And as you can see, some of these song titles are not really creative. Song 2, that's actually how the client wanted it. Of course, I've modified the band name for secrecy. But anyways, so in this case, song 5 I know is going to start, song 6 is going to start side B. So I can go to song 6 in the CD tab and select B. Now this works, I've done double and triple LPs as well. So as you can see, you can select up to the letter Z. Now I've never done a 16 or whatever it would be LP set, but if you're doing a triple LP set, you can go up to, the last side would be side F and beyond. So it's I've never tested this out beyond a triple LP, but it is possible. If you're doing a really big restoration collection, you can do it all in one montage and then just keep going down the line. If this was a triple LP, then I could say these songs are side C and so on. But let me start fresh here. Side A, then song 6 is going to be side B. I think I may have just goofed it all up. Okay, so the one recent thing, if you're not using, I should have mentioned this at the top, but WaveLab 10.0.70 is out. So there's a recent maintenance update for WaveLab that just came out a couple days ago. Solves a couple bugs and things like that. And so download it if you haven't already. Maintenance update. But a few maintenance updates ago, they added a feature in the CD group tab, which I find really handy. I'm going to try to zoom in and make it keep displaying. You can hover. I'm just hovering the mouse over any of the letter A's, and that tells me that CD track group A is 16 minutes and 54 seconds, and CD track group B is 17:48. So that's a really handy tool for figuring out how long the sides are, because sometimes your client is going to lean on you to suggest where side B starts. They might not have thought that far. They just know they want to do it on vinyl. But sometimes I have to say, I think from a technical standpoint, it makes sense to start, side B with, sometimes it's 4 songs on side A and 6 on side B because of the length of the song. And also, I don't want to get too into the weeds, but traditionally, softer songs work better at the end of each side. If you think back to classic albums of the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, a lot of times they ended side A and side B with a softer song because as you push the length of the side, it's harder to produce those louder, denser pieces of music. And so I've had cases where, I may suggest that I think it's good if we end side A with this song because it's more of an acoustic, or just it's a lighter song with no heavy percussion, things like that. So the CD group tab is good for kind of figuring out how long what works, how you're going to arrange it. Now, by changing that, I can see that side B would be 21:04 and side A would be 13:38. That's way too lopsided. Even this it's not bad, but it's a little lopsided. As you can see, side B would be 17:48. Side A would be 16. That's totally normal. But again, that helps you figure out where it's going to be if you're being asked to provide that information. So a cool little trick that may not be in older versions of WaveLab, but I think with 10.050 it was added somewhere around there. So if you're not seeing that feature, you just got to update. So now that I've determined the sides, there's not a whole lot more to do, although I did skip over the step. Right now I would have my digital limiting applied here, and I don't want to get too into the weeds of telling you how to master for vinyl because it's really subjective, and every lathe is different. There's so many variables that I can't really get too specific, and I don't want to. But I think most cutting engineers agree that it's best, or they prefer to cut from a source without any digital limiting so that all the natural peaks are there. Because one thing about vinyl is that the loudness of the record is not related to the loudness of the digital files. And in some cases, it almost works against you. If you take a very loud digital master that looks kind of like that, they can cut it to lacquer and vinyl, but they may have to cut it at a lower average level to make it not any more distorted than it already is. So by using a loud digital master, again, it can be done, but compromises need to be made. Aside from battling all the artifacts from extreme digital limiting, on top of all that, they're going to probably have to cut it a little softer. And in some ways, it's easier for them to cut it because they don't have to worry about any big changes. It's just kind of static. But that's kind of the reason why new vinyl gets a bit of a bad rap. You can do great sounding vinyl from a digital source if it's prepared well. If it's not prepared well and it's already these big distorted waveforms for digital, it's probably not going to be the best sounding vinyl. So you can't really make a blanket statement of vinyl sounds better or digital sounds better. There's so much that goes on with vinyl that can either be great or not great. But my point is, I'm going to remove the digital limiting that I have to kind of do that last push to make it loud for the digital realm. And, there's a number of ways you can approach this. I have a little preset plug-in chain that I like to use for vinyl. And it's nothing too secretive. It's just kind of boring, so I'm not going to show it to you. But one thing that I sometimes do, it's probably not necessary with this record because of how conservatively I captured from analog, but sometimes my captures from analog do have a little bit of maybe hitting the converter, and they look like they're kind of pinned against the ceiling. And sometimes I like to drop that level down just so that whoever's cutting it doesn't think that they're getting something that's been digitally limited, because it looks questionable. And also, there's a theory that plugins, especially ones modeled after analog gear, they kind of operate better at a certain level that isn't insanely loud. So there's kind of two benefits to just dropping the level. But one thing this plugin does is just lowers the level by 3 dB just to get a little more headroom. Again, it's not going to bring back any chopped off peaks from your clipping or converter or other extreme processing. But for me, it just buys a little headroom for working, within the digital realm here. And it produces a file that isn't concerning. Like I said, that's hitting right up against that ceiling where the cutting engineer is going to say, oh, I wonder if I can get something that isn't peak limited. It just kind of takes it out of the equation. And just a simple EQ filter. I do like to do a little center channel de-essing. Nothing too crazy, but just to make sure that there isn't any loud sibilance that's going to be an issue on vinyl. You can get away with some extreme sibilance in digital, but vinyl can be a problem. The other thing, very controversial topic that I'm doing, I always play with it. Sometimes it's none or sometimes it's a little more, but sometimes there's this theory or myth that you need to mono the low end for vinyl, and that's really not true. It is true that, out of phase bass and wide pan bass can be problematic on vinyl, but that doesn't mean you should automatically always mono your low end at 200 hertz for vinyl or 400 hertz. You can get away with more than people might think, but what's not good is just monoing the low end for the sake of monoing it for vinyl because you read on the internet that that's what you're supposed to do. That's just, again, it may not be a total deal breaker, but it's also not recommended if you don't have to do it. So the best advice I can give is to develop a relationship with at least one or maybe a handful of lacquer cutting engineers, depending on their location, country, part of the country, price range, availability, so that if you send something to them, either they're comfortable reaching out to you and saying, hey, I was trying to cut this, or I think even before I start cutting it, this is going to be a problem. Would you like to adjust it? Or on the other hand, I have a few cutting engineers that I've kind of given free rein to say, hey, if you're trying to cut something that you receive from me and you're having a little problem, just make the change. I trust your judgment. You cut lacquers every day. You know your lathe and how it performs and what the outcome is probably going to be. So I give them free rein. Where the problem comes in is when you're shipping it off to an unknown pressing plant or cutting engineer. Some of the more budget pressing plants are really not very open about who's doing the cutting work, and you kind of lose that line of communication. It would be somewhat similar to wanting to get CDs made and sending your unmastered mixes to the CD pressing plant and hoping they do a good job mastering it for a CD. Being a little dramatic, but it's kind of the same thing with vinyl. If you just send off your files to an unknown place and the first thing you hear is a test pressing, well, a lot of things happen in between sending it off and the test pressing, including, cutting the lacquers. So a lot of people get test lacquer cuts so they can make sure everything's good before doing the expensive and time-consuming steps. Anyways, I'm getting a little off track, but my point is you don't need to mono the low end just for the sake of monoing it. I highly recommend leaving that to the cutting engineer and having a dialogue or a relationship where they can tell you if there's a problem and things like that. But, if it's going to a budget place and you're never going to know who's cutting it, it could be said that maybe you want to give yourself a little insurance and maybe mono it at 100 hertz. I don't want to give advice because it's so subjective, but just be aware that you can do anywhere from 0 to a moderate amount depending on what it sounds like, where it's going. But in a perfect world, you're having a relationship with the cutting engineer that can handle that instead of you just trying to guess, because it really is just a guess at that point as far as monoing the low end. But I think most of them, I think 99% would agree that removing the limiting is probably preferable for cutting lacquers. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Eric Valentine, a pretty well-known producer. If I don't have it handy, but maybe I'll put it in the notes. But he did a pretty good YouTube video about mastering for vinyl. I think he must master some of his own stuff. And he kind of talked about this too. Like, yes, removing the limiter is going to change it anywhere from a little bit to sort of a lot. But some of that comes back with, just due to the nature of vinyl. I don't want to say vinyl is a limiter, but it's not, it does have some limitations. And, what may seem like really loud, pokey drums when you remove the limiter probably is going to average out a little bit when it's all said and done, you're listening to the vinyl. So that's kind of that was a broad stroke comment, but my point is you do want to remove the limiting either entirely, or you maybe just want to ease up on it quite a bit so it's not so extreme. Because vinyl really just doesn't handle the high average loudness very well. It likes the needle and the lathe, the cutter head, they like to move and follow the waveforms instead of following a brick wall. So again, no hard and fast rules, just either remove or ease up greatly on the limiter depending on how much it impacts the overall, sound of the record. And when in doubt, ask the cutting engineer. You could maybe provide two. You could say, here's one with the limiting kind of eased up, and here's one with 0 limiting, to see what they prefer to cut from. So I don't want to get too into the weeds of talking about that because I don't cut lacquers, and that's a whole another art form. But when you remove the limiter, obviously you're going to find that it sounds a little different. It's more open, and when you turn up your speakers, you might find that it even sounds better because it can breathe. But I've had times when I have to change a little bit of the song-to-song relationship. So you can, of course, if you've removed the limiter and a song is feeling a little soft, you can move it up. If a song is feeling a little loud, you can, of course, move it down. You can even do some automation. This isn't a great example, but I've had, vinyl, it's kind of tricky, but, it has a noise floor, and so does, turntables, preamps. There's a higher noise floor associated with vinyl than digital. So if you're doing something that's highly dynamic, something with a lot of range between the quietest moments and the loudest moments, there's a good chance that the quietest moments could be too quiet. And I don't want to say too quiet because that's subjective, but it could be that the quiet sections get too close to the noise floor of the vinyl itself. And I don't know how much automation the cutting engineers do when they're working. I'm sure they do some, but I've had cases where when I'm listening to a record with the limiter off, and I kind of purposely listen at a lower level to sort of simulate what's going to happen once the music gets below or into the noise floor of the vinyl. So sometimes I'll do this at a really low level, or I even have a small mono speaker here. And I'm not saying I always do this, but it could be a case where this middle section of the song gets too quiet. Maybe it drops off too much. And it wasn't really a problem on the digital master because we're using a limiter to squeeze the average loudness higher. But maybe, I'm just hypothetically, maybe this section gets a little too soft. So it's not unheard of for me to kind of automate certain parts up. Again, I'm doing it very fast and crude. Or maybe the intro of a song is too quiet. And it worked for digital, again, because of the limiting and the essentially no noise floor of digital audio. But maybe, you're listening to it from a vinyl perspective and thinking perhaps the intro of a song is just too soft compared to the rest of it. So that does happen. Again, not on every project, but it's something to be aware of, especially if you have a song that sort of really fades in from some kind of ambient noise. So again, you want to ease up or remove the limiter. And I also have a dither at the very end. Now I do have a true peak limiter, just kind of a safety net. And the cool thing about this limiter is that it has a delta mode. So if it ever engages, I can hear it, but it's just there kind of, it's not doing any limiting ideally, probably ever, but it's just kind of there for fun, I guess, if you will. But it's not doing any serious limiting. But I do have a dither plugin after that. And I know that with my normal rendering workflow, I don't include the dithering at this stage because I do the long render. And then I create a new montage where then I insert the dithering there and render track by track each wave file. But for vinyl, I have the dither inserted right away because we're going to go right for it. Kind of the reason for my digital rendering process is because not just WaveLab, but many pieces of software, they have problems, or they can have problems rendering track by track. When you have clip effects going, plugins on each song, which you can do. As you can see, I have a couple EQs. I have a little EQ on a couple songs. And again, you probably want to keep all that stuff because that's what made the digital master great. You really just want to ease up on the limiting itself. But my point is, when you're doing the digital rendering, if you have songs, especially if you have songs that overlap, you can run into problems if you try to render track by track with a heavy plug-in load happening. So that's why I do it that way. But with vinyl, we're already kind of doing that. We're going to render one long file for each side. So there's no overlapping audio or track by track renders. We're just doing one long render for the whole side. So I can include the dithering in this stage because it's not going to have any further processing from me. Now, I guess you could debate whether we should be sending 32-bit or 64-bit float files to the cutting engineer because they're most likely inevitably going to be applying some processing, but that's kind of getting into the weeds as well. I like to just provide 24-bit files that have been dithered, and they can handle it from there. I think any potential concerns that arise from that get kind of lost in the noise floor of the vinyl itself. So anyways, my point is I'm going to listen. Obviously, I listen to the whole thing again and make sure everything feels good in terms of the average song levels when I skip around. It's easy to skip around. And again, this one's a couple LUFS lower than maybe if it was like a rock album or a modern pop album, but kind of used it for a dramatic effect here. Because really the digital level means nothing compared to the vinyl. They're going to determine the length of the vinyl when they start preparing to cut it. So whether it's minus 20 LUFS or minus 14 or minus 30 LUFS, it kind of doesn't matter for the vinyl. So there's no magic number, if you can imagine that. So basically, I'm skipping around and listening, make sure everything feels good. If there's an intro that feels too soft, now that there's no limiting, I could maybe address that. Could also be a case where something gets too loud, so I'm not saying it is, but, you could, in theory, draw some level automation here and deal with some peaks if you feel like it's getting too loud. I think volume automation is under talked about in mastering. I use quite a lot of volume automation, whether it's to make the downbeat of a chorus hit a little harder or making the front half of a song, if it's a song that really builds, making the front half not too quiet. Making sure the end doesn't get too squashed, because if you try to make the first part of a song loud enough, it could be that the last chorus is just way too squeezed. But if you do a little tasteful level automation throughout the song, you can kind of have it both ways. But that's a little off topic. So let's say that I like how this sounds and I'm ready to render. I have some render presets dialed up here, and at the very bottom is vinyl side A. And I think I mentioned this, but that little line means that I can just press the letter V and that preset is chosen. So that's kind of a nice feature of WaveLab. And I'll explain what the presets are doing. And I'll get to some questions in a moment. But what this preset is doing is saying that you want to render CD track group A, which would be side A. You want it to be a 24-bit wave, and this is all kind of pre-configured, but it's going to match the sample rate. So it's going to remain at 96K. It's going to be a 24-bit file. And with WaveLab and most programs, you have to add the dithering yourself. Just because you're choosing 24-bit doesn't mean it's going to automatically dither somewhere. So that's why I have the dither plugin last in the montage output. And as you can see, I have no plugins in the master section except my metering plugin. So this is the end of the line right here. There's whatever clip effects you decide to do, which is your per song effects. And this is, again, my just kind of starting point. I don't always use all these plugins. Every project's a little different, but for me, that's a good starting point. Just to catch a little center channel sibilance, things like that. I already discussed that. So that's what this preset is choosing, is vinyl side A. And the last thing you have to do is, well, there's two things you have to do besides that, is give the file a name. When you're rendering by track, it knows to use the marker names for each file. When you're rendering a wave of each side, you have to provide a name. And I'm very big on naming schemes for projects. And as you can see, every format of this record so far has had a naming scheme that's very clear as to what it is and what format it is. And this is going to be no different. But the cool thing about WaveLab is I can already grab the naming scheme from a previous render, whether it's already there or the drop-down menu is really handy. So I'm just going to copy the naming scheme I've been using for this record and paste it in there. And the last thing that this render preset did is it's going to add side A to the file name. So I don't have to type in side A, it's just there. And that's why there's a different, part of why there's a different render preset for each side of the record. Because it's going to, number one, render the correct CD track group, and number two, it's going to add a side A to the end of the file name, so I don't have to manually deal with that. Let's see how long this takes. Oh, and the very last thing I want to do is create a folder for it. So I've already rendered the digital file, so I have a great starting point. I usually just type in the word vinyl, and now I'm going to get a new folder for the vinyl files that has the same name as everything else. And let's see how long this takes. About a minute. I think I can talk for a minute while this does this, because I want to show you the next thing. Well, actually, what I do next is I go right to side B. I choose the vinyl side B preset. And as you can see, the two things that changed are now it's going to render CD track group B, and it's going to add side B to the file name, which is handy. So I can usually render those at the same time. And then I start to do some other stuff, which I'll show you. The other part of this render preset is that it's going to open the resulting audio file. I don't always do this, but especially for vinyl, because it's a physical product that's being manufactured and it's hard to redo stuff, you always want to listen to your renders and make sure that there was no problem. Even though we're rendering one long file, which mitigates a lot of problems, I've had cases where a certain plugin might go into demo mode because the iLock didn't sync up or something. And then now your vinyl master file could have a beep or a silence every 30 seconds, and that would be bad. I mean, hopefully the cutting engineer would catch that, but it's embarrassing to send out a file like that. So my render preset automatically opens the file so you're reminded to listen to them. And so while the files are rendering, the next thing I do is make the PDF file. So I have a preset which is just P and Q, which stands for PQ report. I believe, you have to bear with me because I always use the shortcut, but it's up here. Yeah, it's in the CD tab. It's this icon. Generate audio CD report, same deal. And I have a preset for just about everything. I have a preset for the sheets. So what I would choose here is JP Start Vinyl 96K. Now I have presets, sometimes I'll be at 88.2, and the only thing that really changes is the wording in the box, or once in a while if I'm doing an old remastering thing and we're only have 44.1 available, maybe I'm working at 44.1. But anyways, that's the difference between these presets is just the wording. But we're at 96K. Let me flip back because I don't want to get distracted by what I'm seeing there. So while they're rendering, I open up this window, choose the correct CD report preset. The nice thing is when you go into that menu, you can see a bunch of recently used rendering paths. So what happens there is, I can just pick the vinyl folder. Right? I don't have to type this in or find it. I can just open up this window or this menu and pick. It knows that I just started rendering files there, so it's easy to just pick that. And this is the default name of the PDF, which you could use, I suppose. But I like to clear it and just paste in. I usually have it already in my clipboard because I named the output file that. I like to name it that, and then I just manually type in _side A and press apply. And this creates a CD report, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. The other thing I do, this is just a personal thing, I like to make it really clear that it's side A, because even though the report says track group A, it's written kind of small, and track group A doesn't always correlate with side A, even though it does to WaveLab users. A cutting engineer may not pick that up right away, so I just like to add that, and then of course go back. I can use the same, I don't have a preset for each side. All I do is, I must have just changed, I accidentally changed it. So let me pretend I didn't accidentally change it. So by default it does group A, then all you have to do is change it to group B, and then replace the A with a B. And there we have, this is kind of the beauty of it all. Even though, what is the song? Chickadees and Robins starts at about 1654 in the montage. The CD report is telling me that it starts at 0 seconds. So that's what the cutting engineers really want to see, that, and they're seeing that the second song of side B, Drizzle, that starts at 2:51, and that makes more sense to them than saying that song starts at 1946 or something like that. So same with side B. I like to just type in side B and just make it really clear that that's side B. So now when I go to my folder, the reason I rename, I don't like the default name of the PDFs because it's long, and I like for the PDF to match the name of the WAV file, so it's just really clear for the cutting engineer what they're looking at. They're looking at a PDF and a WAV for side A, a PDF and a WAV for side B, and it's really nice. They can see the total duration of side B, the number of songs, and again, the timing, where each song starts, and then, of course, the length of each song. So now, again, this is more dynamic and a little softer than I normally do. I could have picked a better starting point or a better project, but it is what it is. But the important thing is that it sounds good. So, of course, we want to listen to this and make sure there's no problems at all, but especially, problem areas are things like the very start of a file and the very end of a file. Occasionally there could be a plugin glitch. I haven't had one in the longest time. And of course you want to listen to make sure that there wasn't any weird errors. Like I mentioned, I've had it happen where I think it was an ozone module went into demo mode, and I didn't have the plugin interface open, so I didn't catch it until I rendered the file and then listened to it and said, why is there a silence every, I think it's 30 seconds. And basically I had to just play with the iLock app, and it's a boring story, but you obviously want to listen to this stuff. And then the other cool thing with WaveLab, as you can see, this file has markers embedded. Now there's no guarantee that whatever software the cutting engineer uses, that they're going to see these markers. If they're using a Pro Tools, probably not going to pick up these markers. But if they're using any kind of application that can read generic markers embedded in a file, then the markers typically show up in their DAW session. That just makes it even easier. It almost renders the PDF files useless, but it's just a good extra piece of information. So that's what the files kind of look like in terms of markers. That's how they look in your Finder. I, of course, zip everything up. I think Mac Finder calls it compress. But you want to zip it up typically so that they can download it in one link and the data doesn't get corrupted, things like that. But that's essentially exporting vinyl masters in WaveLab. And I always tell the client to listen to those as well. I mean, they're going to think, and I always give them a warning like, hey, these are not as loud as the digital master, so just turn up your speakers. And I have a little write-up that says all these things I'm talking about. The loudness of the vinyl is determined by a number of other things. Communicate with your cutting engineer what you're looking for. Get a test lacquer or test cut. Know who you're working with, because vinyl quality can be all over the map. And unfortunately, it's not a place you want to cut corners, because the sound quality can really suffer. But that's a whole nother topic. Let's see, I have a question about PDF templates. Let me talk a little bit more about that. The letterhead. I set it up so long ago, but as you can see on the reports, you can put your studio logo, and that's all saved in the preset. And the other thing I guess I could show you in here, I just have a little text that's saved with my template that says the audio is 24-bit, 96K, one file per album side. I mean, that's just, and sometimes I'll modify it. Sometimes I'll even say, I know this is a 25-minute side, but that's how the client wanted it. I gave them a warning and they said, let's just try it anyway. You can put any number of notes in there. You can say, call me if there's a problem. You can type anything you want in addition to what's here, but I just kind of use that as a starting point. So yeah, once you have your CD report how you want it, you can just click right here and choose Save As. As you can see, I have 6 templates for these reports. Vinyl at 3 different sample rates, common ones. I have done a vinyl at 192, so then I just had to modify the wording. I have a starting point for CD masters, cassette, which we'll get to in a moment, and then just basic digital master. So you can save all this stuff. The header image is up here. It's this checkbox, and then you point it to your logo. There was kind of a small bug on Mac where the logo looked fine in here, but when you export a PDF or print it, it's grainy, but that's been fixed recently. And I'm not a graphics expert, but my website person made a .svg file, and not only does that look good on the computer, but when we print it, it doesn't get grainy. Like the logo used to get, basically what would happen is the logo you had to use a small logo because the logo would enlarge on the PDF file, and then it would look grainy, but to get it, you had to play with it. Anyways, that bug is solved, so you can kind of do what you want with the logo, but I just have it saved as, and you can play with the font and all that stuff. I just haven't had time. I set it up a long time ago and haven't changed it. So that's vinyl in a nutshell. I'm going to read through some questions. If anyone has any quick questions about vinyl, you can type it in now, and I'll try to get to it now, or I can try it later too. But so yeah, I think typically vinyl masters do have more dynamic range, little to no peak limiting, but again, because of the noise floor vinyl, there is such a thing as too much dynamic range, where it's maybe some parts are getting lost in the noise floor or too close to the noise floor, things like that. And again, if you have a good relationship with a cutting engineer, they can either kind of just do that. They can, it depends on the arrangement. If they're getting hired to do a flat cut and they got to do 10 or 20 sides in a day, that's one thing. But, if you give them a license or permission or ask them and they're nice enough to roll up their sleeves and maybe do some level automation as they're cutting it. That's great. You just never, my point is you never know who's cutting it and how invested they're going to be. Hopefully they're very invested, but with some of the budget places, you may be surprised. So typically more dynamic range and just more transient, like a limited waveform has really very little transient detail, whereas a as you can see with these songs, you can really still see a lot of the transient. So that's just, generally speaking, blanket statement, a little more vinyl friendly, but again, there's no rules. I'm sure there's been some vinyl cut from brick-walled waves that still sounds pretty good, but we'll never know how good it could have sounded if they provided not limited waves. So again, no rules. I don't want, there's no blanket statements. I actually don't know too much about the surround labels. Maybe we can ask this in the WaveLab group and I can think about it a little more, but I know there are some changes coming to the surround area, so that might be something good for an update coming in the future. Can't say when, but I typically work with just stereo montages, so I haven't dabbled with surround, but I know that for cutting engineers, they may want to be playing, two versions of preview. Again, this is something we'll have to maybe talk about in the group, but you can change the name if you just go into audio connections. Let me change to my RME card because that has a lot of options. Yeah, so you can go in here and I may have to quit WaveLab for that to take effect. But yeah, you can go into the audio connections tab and rename things if that makes more sense to you. Let's see. So playback. I thought I had this named at one point, but you could name this main 1 or main right or preview left, preview right. So I think you could do things like that, or you could do preview two left and preview 2 right. So you can rename them, and it should show up in certain places. Obviously, you have to assign them to an output, but I believe that if you rename them here, because it does say name, that you can name them as you wish, and then you can save all these as presets. As you can see, I have a audio connections preset for my in-the-box workflow. I just have a simple AES interface, and then I also have my RME card for doing all the analog stuff. You can save all this stuff as presets in this area, so that may help you there. So hopefully that helps. I'm going to move on to cassette mastering, and then this is going to be a shorter episode than usual. Cassette mastering is kind of it's a weird thing because when cassettes, and this is true for vinyl too, but especially when cassettes were in their prime, there was no real digital limiting. There was no, what worked for vinyl, it worked for cassette typically, with some exceptions and things like that, but there wasn't, a lot of times one master kind of worked for all the formats in terms of delivery. And then when vinyl started to become popular again, that kind of coincided with the height of the loudness wars, which still hasn't come down. But I think people realized that these loud digital masters don't really translate well to vinyl. So maybe we should make a special vinyl master. And then that spiraled to, mastered for iTunes or Apple Digital Masters. And now we got all these variations. And then just the fact that some streaming services accept high-res files and some don't, it's kind of a big mess. So we end up with more than one file to send out, and it's gotten kind of fragmented. But anyways, cassette is tricky. There's no way to know what kind of tape your client is going to choose to get used for duplication or production of cassette. There's different tape types. They all have different frequency response. I think there's no reason to concern yourself with that, because in the perfect world, or not even in a perfect world, in most cases, the place that's making the cassettes is going to handle that. They're going to make sure that whatever they've gotten as a source is going to sound as good as possible, on whatever type of tape is being used. And they have ways to change the EQ bias so that it all makes sense. So you don't have to get into the weeds of the tape type, although there is a good web article that I'll try to put a link in the notes to this video, but the website is sonologist.com with a Y. He did a really good article about mastering to cassette tape, and this could be handy for some of the DIY people that might be doing cassettes themselves. But it talks about the history of cassette tape and all sorts of things to consider, with different types of Dolby noise reduction. This is kind of the Bible here for modern cassette mastering if you really want to get into the weeds. Once in a while I get somebody that's kind of doing their own cassette dubbing from a master that I make, but typically they're sending out the files to a professional company that handles the cassette production. But anyways, this is kind of an interesting read if you haven't read it yet. Sonologist with a Y.com. Pretty cool stuff about cassette tapes, and it's fairly recent, so it kind of takes into account of where we are today in the history of cassette as well. Anyways, my point being, the one cassette place that I know of in the U.S., the main one, is pretty antiquated, and they require the files to be 16-bit 44.1K, even though in theory you could feed higher quality audio into the cassette duplicator. They must have an antiquated system, and because back in the day that was probably considered pretty standard and whatever for digital. But I have had one or two cases in the last couple of years where I should have done my research a little more or refreshed my memory, but I have had a place that did cassettes from a 24-bit 96K file, and I thought that was cool. I mean, I don't know how much difference it's going to make, because cassette has such a fingerprint and sound to it. It's hard to say if you'll be able to notice the difference, but I'm always a fan of best practices and starting with the best source if you can. My point is, you probably don't want to send, I think on the website for National Cassette in the US here, they say, if they receive files higher than 16-bit 44.1, that they're going to reduce them to 1644.1 anyway. So probably better for you to do that as the mastering engineer than let them do it, because we don't know what software they use to reduce the quality. So again, if you really want to reach out to your client and see who they're using, maybe there's some cases here and there where you can use high-res files for cassette, but I think most of the cassettes being professionally done, even through brokers, because they're probably just hiring National Cassette to do the cassette duplication and taking care of the packaging themselves. But most cassettes being professionally done are probably done at National, and that's what their limitations are with their system, and it is what it is. So there's two ways to approach this. With this particular record, as you can see, this is a really traditional, like, bossa nova, jazz type thing. So as interesting as it looks, it didn't sound good with any digital limiting because due to the style of music. So and that's kind of why I picked it. In this case, I could open up my 16-bit 44.1 digital master and just let it go. I have a special preset for cassettes that's very similar to the vinyl, where you would just choose cassette side A, choose the naming scheme, put it in there, type in cassette instead of vinyl, and now I'm going to have I do need to, so what I'm going too fast, but even though I'm not changing much, I would still call it, 1644 cassette premaster, something like that, so I'm not destroying the digital master. And this is, if you have a sharp eye, this is slightly different It shouldn't be, but I had to make some modifications for the vinyl. But essentially, it would be the same track layout. So you're just choosing what's on side A, what's on side B, and rendering a continuous wave of side A and a continuous wave of side B. And again, with the reports, I do have a little preset for that. Cassette, where is it? Cassette, and then I can choose the cassette folder because it's right there. The only thing really different with the cassette preset is that it says the audio is 16-bit 44.1, one file per program, which is technically what tapes are called, program side. The difference really with the template is just the wording on there, that it's a lower, what the format is. And this may not seem like a big deal like right now, but if you do a lot of masters, it really helps to have these things already typed in so that they're consistent and you don't have to keep typing it in. If you master 1 or 2 albums a month, it's probably not a big deal to just type this in, but when all you do is mastering, it helps to have all this stuff as presets. So again, I could just apply that and type in. Sometimes I'll do program or side. It's kind of the same thing. Side is just a little shorter, so it doesn't take as much space. And change it to side B. And again, I didn't do the name, but you get the idea. If you want the PDF file name to match the WAV file, you can manually type it in here. And do side B. So that's, my whole point here is if your digital master isn't super squashed, I think it's probably going to work just fine on cassette. If your digital master is kind of on the loud side, in the -8 LUFS or louder, you may want to consider, again, kind of like vinyl, easing up on that limiting. I'm not a cassette expert by any means. These are just kind of things I've observed and absorbed over the years. But I think unless you're going for super extreme digital loudness, the digital master probably works for cassette. This is really where your instinct, opinion, experience is going to come into play. I can't, tell you everything to do, but unless I did the crazy loud digital master, I'll usually use it for cassette, aside from the formatting, again, where it's just one file per side. And again, I goofed up that name. It should, in theory, match. So that's what someone would want to look like. And now we have a folder of 16-bit 44.1 files for cassette, one file per side. And that's, especially with cassette tape duplicate, they don't want to be thinking about the song order, the song spacing. It also just kind of leaves room for things to go wrong when you send one file per side. So I think this is a fine practice. So now if you, let's say you had kind of a loud digital master and you want to go back and tweak it for cassette, that article I shared has some good information about some things you may want to consider. But I don't have a preset. I don't have a template for this because I don't do it often enough, but this could be my cassette master. I went back to the digital version, the approved digital version, and did a save as. And now I'm kind of free to tweak for cassette. I probably wouldn't necessarily need to mono the low end or consider that. Sibilance, maybe not as much of an issue on cassette, or at least in a different way. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do to make this different for cassette, but kind of the same deal. The digital loudness doesn't really relate to the loudness of the cassette tape. It's really apples and oranges. They're going to make the tapes as loud as they can. Now, it doesn't have the same limitations as vinyl, but it's similar in the sense that they're going to make the cassettes, as loud as they can before it starts to sound distorted. And they want it loud enough that it's not in the noise floor of the cassette tape. So, they're going to help you out here to some degree, so you don't have to overthink it, because analog and digital levels are apples and oranges. You can't say that your cassette master should be minus 12 LUFS or minus 16 LUFS. It kind of doesn't matter because someone's feeding that digital signal into an analog machine. So they're just going to do what they know is best. So there's no numbers to shoot for here. It's just that if you are doing a fairly loud digital master and the client is for some reason doing cassette, and they're going to be very critical of the cassette sound, which I think those three things are probably rare. You may want to ease up a hair on the limiting. So there's a little more breathing room so the cassette, has a little more life to it. Because again, we're not in this digital loudness war. I mean, again, the tape's going to have a certain loudness, but it might translate well. So that's really all I have to say about cassettes. And then if you are doing it this way, there's a number of ways to approach it. I don't do it often enough to have a set way, to be honest with you, because I would say in most cases my digital master can work for cassette. I just render it differently. But if you were going back to the digital master and tweaking it for cassette, you would kind of do the same thing. You would do side A, side B. And then for rendering, you'd probably want to render it. This is where I don't have any presets because I don't do it very often, but you could render, you could change this to 32-bit floating point, because what you're going to do is render you're going to render a wave of each side. But if you're going to use some kind of external sample rate converter to get it down to 44.1 and 16-bit, that's where you're going to want to apply your dither. So in this case, you wouldn't really want to have dither in this process, because you're going to be rendering floating point waves at 96 and then using something like RX or the WaveLab batch processor, to convert those floating point 96K waves down to 16-bit 44.1, which is, like I said, what the one place in the US at least, that's their antiquated system. I know that it's kind of strange to think about, but that's just kind of the way it is. I've never taken the time to call them up and ask them why. We just kind of deal with that. And if I think of it, I'll post a place that was able to do cassettes from a high-res source. I don't come across it often, but there is a place that'll do it. Now, I don't know how good their quality is in general, but at least they were able to make the tapes from high-res files. But anyways, so if you're going to jump back this far, you would not want to dither. You'd still want to render a wave of each side, and then, of course, you would apply the dithering on the sample rate conversion, double-check the files, and send it off. So that's really all I have to say about cassette mastering. You could get into the weeds if you want, but I think that article sums it up pretty well of the different tape types and noise reductions. And in theory, those are all things that the cassette duplication place is handling. You just want to give them the best starting point, which you don't want to overthink it either. You don't want to start doing things because you read about them on the internet or just because you think, try to stick to things that work. So I'll see if there's any questions before we wrap this up. If there's no questions now, you can always go to the WaveLab users group on Facebook. And that's the best place to ask questions, because not only can I answer them, but other people can chime in and other people can learn from them as well. So rather than a direct message, it's great if you just post it there. I'll get to it just as fast and things like that. So I know this is a little bit delayed. So if there's no questions, I'm going to stop the stream fairly soon. And thanks for tuning in. Next month, I'm not sure what the topic's going to be next month, but within the next month or two, maybe 3, I'm going to have another guest. A few months back, we had Pete Lyman on, and he was great. So I'm going to bring back another WaveLab user in the near future, not next month, but soon, and kind of do more of an interview style about how they use WaveLab, why they use WaveLab, things like that, and about, some specialty stuff that they may do. So that'll be announced soon, but it looks like there's no more questions. So thanks for tuning in and watching and using WaveLab. And if you haven't downloaded the latest update from a few days ago, 10.0.70 is out, solves a few bugs. One of them was strange where the reference track, so if you make a reference track for some reason and I have it locked because I don't use it, which is why I didn't notice it, but for some reason on reference track specifically, the track gain and panning were not being applied. So that's been solved in 10.0.7 and a couple other. Does it sending DDP? The question is it common to send DDP for cassette? Let me step back by saying the reason it's not great to send a DDP for vinyl is because there's no reason to reduce your audio to 16-bit 44.1 for vinyl cutting, for lacquer cutting, because they can cut from higher sample rates in 24-bit. And of course, you want to process it a little differently for vinyl. There's no harm in sending a DDP for cassette, in my opinion, from a fidelity standpoint, because like I mentioned, due to the nature of the main place I'm aware of in the U.S., the audio is going to be cut, or the cassettes are going to be made from CD quality audio anyways. So I don't think from a sonic standpoint there's harm in sending a DDP. The problem is I don't know how well versed a cassette place is in handling a DDP, and then they still have to figure out where side B starts. It makes more work for them, and it leaves room for something to go wrong. So I think it's highly recommended to simply provide one file per cassette side. Now, and speaking of cassettes, I've had cases where clients or bands, it's like a 3 or 4 song cassette. They'll do all 4 songs on both sides, so it's like the same on both sides. That's not uncommon. So I guess that would solve that case in the case of a DDP. I guess I wouldn't recommend sending a DDP because you just never know how it's going to be handled. Obviously, a CD manufacturer knows how to handle a DDP, and I'm sure the cassette manufacturer has gotten them, and there's DDP players and all this stuff, but I think sending a DDP for cassette just leaves room. It doesn't really help, and it just leaves room for something to go wrong if you can't tell I'm a worst case scenario person. So better to just send it as one file per side, so there's no gray area about where side B starts, and no one has to wrestle with the DDP or do weird stuff to export it using who knows what. Just make it simple for them. And I have heard of vinyl brokers asking for DDP for vinyl, and if anyone asks you that, it's probably a good indication that you should find a different place, because there's, for some of the reasons I just mentioned, DDP for vinyl means someone has to figure out where side B starts, which not really a big deal, but it can create some gray area. And then of course the audio is unnecessarily reduced to CD quality. And it also means that perhaps the vinyl, or perhaps the audio wasn't optimized for vinyl. I hate to say it, but I've had cases where, even though I asked this on my website, do you need a vinyl master? I've had cases where, unknowing to me, people will just take the digital files and get vinyl made, and then I don't know anything about it until I see online that, oh, now this is out on vinyl. And it's like, I'm not wishing this for the sake of I want more work or money. I would have made it for free if they just said, hey, we're going to do vinyl. Can you make a vinyl cutting master? Yeah, it's not that hard to do, and it could have made it much better. So anytime you hear about DDP for vinyl, it's kind of suspect, because it makes you wonder how well it's been prepped for vinyl. I do exclusively use WaveLab for mastering for vinyl. By the time, even before I assemble my final montage, I've done all the spectral editing that I need to do. So I wouldn't really need spectral layers just for vinyl. I've gone through with headphones and removed any ticks and pops. And one thing I've really been doing in the last year or two is de-essing with a spectral editor. I think it's more transparent and effective than trying to do it 100% with a plug-in de-esser. Plug-in de-essers can work if everything's the same, but some S's are louder than others. I just find de-essing with a spectral editor much more effective. It takes a little longer, but then it's done. You don't have to worry about it again. So that can work well for digital and for vinyl. So definitely I don't bring it into spectral layers specifically for vinyl. I mean, it could be useful for troubleshooting, but for me, I handle that even for the digital master, so there wouldn't be a need. If someone has sequenced their album themselves, how would you like to receive the guide sequence? Well, typically, if someone has a specific sequence in mind for their record, it's really preferable to receive the songs as individual files and then a mock-up. It can even be an MP3 of the full record as one file. And the reason that is I've had people send me projects where they've sequenced it already and the songs overlap, and that's fine. But the problem there is let's say you want to apply certain processing on song 2. Now you don't have a clean ending for song 1 because they're already overlapped, and then the processing you're going to do on song 2 makes the tail end of song 1 change. So it may not be a big deal or that noticeable, but it can be a problem if the songs are already crossfaded when you receive it for mastering. And most times I can ask for the original files used to create that mock-up because I like to have the full tails so each song can have its own unique processing, and I'll still do the overlaps. I'll also have them send me a continuous file of the full record as one file. And I use that more as a visual map to line up the individual files. So in the end, it sounds the same, but I've just found that it's not ideal to have the songs already overlapped. Now, for the sake of vinyl, that's kind of how we do it because, in my opinion, the changes from song to song are going to be much less that a cutting engineer is doing. So it's overall okay to send it all as one file. But hopefully that answered the question about sequencing, and I would say for 90% of projects, I already received the songs as individual files, and they're expecting me to put them in the correct order, do any overlaps, take care of the heads and tails, the fade outs and stuff like that. That answers that. The spectral de-esser, it's not a plugin. It's things like Spectra Layers or Isotope RX, any kind of, or even WaveLab has spectral editing built in. If you it doesn't have it in the montage, but if you open up a WAV file and go to spectrogram view, and I like to change the spectrogram view. Where is that? I don't do it often enough. I think the orange one looks a little better, but any spectral editor, and this is not a great example because it's an instrumental record, but I've just found that listening and highlighting the S sound, you can really see the S sounds if there's a sibilance problem in a spectral editor. Highlighting those and just kind of dimming them, or however you want to do it, just turning down the S sound of the spectral editor is, for me, much more effective than, I'll still use a little bit of overall broad stereo de-essing and mixing, whether it's in mid-side. Usually it is in mid-side mode to catch the lead vocals in the center, but I found that when you really have sibilance problems, the best way to tackle them is spectral editing. Takes a little longer, but it's more rewarding and more effective. So hopefully that helps. Yep, I go S by S. There's no preset. And same is true with clicks and pops. In theory, you could run the declicker on a whole song, but it's also going to affect snare transients and acoustic guitar picking, and you really just have to listen and go problem by problem. So yeah, I go S by S. And it's weird. Some projects, not every S sound is a problem, and I just kind of listen. And when one pops out and is distracting, I can circle it. Again, this doesn't have any. I should probably use the lasso, but this doesn't have any S's. But let's say that was a S. And I can highlight it and do any number of things. Some programs have an actual de-esser module that I could hit apply on the de-esser, but it's only going to apply it to the circled area, not the whole song. But yeah, you definitely have to go S by S. And I found that to be very successful, pun intended. So if there's no more questions after that, I'm going to wrap up this video. And if there's any follow-ups, just go over to the WaveLab users group on Facebook, and we can connect there. Don't forget about the cassette mastering website. I'll put that in the video notes, and we'll see you next month or on the WaveLab forum in the meantime.